Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know, 3rd edition, by Robert Paarlberg. Narrated by Rick Adamson. Preface to the 3rd edition of Food Politics. I have enjoyed preparing this 3rd edition of Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know, because it has reminded me of important changes seen in food and farm politics around the world since the 2nd edition was published in 2013. Since that time, 3 unexpected events temporarily disrupted the policy environment. First was President Trump's trade war with China, which interrupted America's exports of soybeans and pork when China retaliated. Second was the COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2020, which put supply chains under stress and locked down food service in large parts of the world. Third was the 2022 war in Ukraine, which interrupted wheat and fertilizer exports, and which, at this writing, is still underway. Political and policy change was also driven by 4 more powerful and durable factors: the continued rise of China, scientific discoveries, including a new genetic improvement method for crops and animals named CRISPR, innovations from food entrepreneurs such as plant-based and cell-grown imitation meats, and, of course, climate change. I agreed with my editor at Oxford that such developments together, in addition to many smaller changes plus the simple passage of time, had altered the food politics landscape enough to justify a new edition of the book. Since the previous edition of Food Politics, my own professional involvement in food and farming has continued and deepened, both within the university world and beyond. As the chair of an independent steering committee for a consultative group on International Agricultural Research Program on Agriculture for Nutrition and Health, A4NH, I have been in a position to review research projects in nutrition as well as farming, making visits to field sites in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. I also continued to serve as a consultant to the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, conducting a series of impact assessments for that organization, and for 4 years I worked as a co-investigator on an R01 grant from the National Institutes of Health on policy strategies to improve diets and reduce cardiovascular disease in the United States. This project led to the publication of academic journal articles on sugar-sweetened beverage taxes and on efforts to strengthen health impacts in the SNAP food stamp program. Then, in 2021, I joined a task force on food and nutrition security at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C., to prepare policy briefs for the 2023 Farm Bill. Since the 2nd edition of Food Politics, I have also written 2 additional books. One was published in 2015 by Oxford University Press, titled The United States of Excess. This book explained why America has been a global outlier in its excessive consumption of both food and fossil fuel. The other book, published in 2021 by Knopf, was written for a popular audience and is titled Resetting the Table: Straight Talk About the Food We Grow and Eat. In 2022, this book won a Nautilus Book Award in the category of Sustainability. As in earlier editions, I should share with curious listeners some information about my family background, because political perspectives are invariably shaped by personal experiences. My father was raised on a farm in Indiana, became a professor of agricultural economics, and then a senior government official, and passed along to me his interests in public policy and international travel, plus an agrarian heritage I am proud to celebrate. My concern for rural poverty and undernutrition dates from an early visit I made to India and Nepal, where my brother was serving as a Peace Corps volunteer. I returned later to study the evolution of food and farming policies in South Asia, and eventually worked in more than a dozen countries in Africa as well. where my active research efforts remain ongoing. In this book, I try to keep my own personal perspectives in their proper place, but I cannot pretend they are absent. I take pride in my independence. In my long career as a university-based academic, I have never been funded or employed by any private company. My research has sometimes been funded by private foundations and sometimes by governmental or intergovernmental agencies, but most often I turned for research support to the generosity of my longtime employer, Wellesley College. I want to take another opportunity here to thank this wonderful institution. As for my political leanings, I have always been a registered Democrat, yet my views on food and farming do not fall neatly into partisan categories. The sections of this book that address food trade and science-based farming are likely to irritate some of my fellow Democrats and please the political right, but the sections that address food companies, development assistance, climate change, and animal welfare are likely to do the opposite. In modern societies where few people still work the land as full-time farmers, and where markets offer an ever wider range of choices about what to eat, how to eat, and how much to eat, the politics of food has come to extend far beyond material questions of who gets what, or even left versus right. Nor is there a unified perspective among academic specialists. Biologists and economists are routinely challenged on such matters by philosophers, ecologists, and sociologists. Originally trained as a political scientist, I try to remain open to multiple perspectives. I share with food activists considerable dissatisfaction with today's world of food and farming. Too much of our food is unhealthy, too much of our farming is still unsustainable, too many farm workers are underpaid, and too many of our rural societies remain unjust. Our world of 8 billion food consumers is still not being adequately or properly fed. I may be less scolding toward our world food system than some, and also less pessimistic about the future, but I see the value of pessimism in motivating political leaders to act. I offer this updated and revised edition of Food Politics: What Everyone Needs to Know as a fresh starting point for problem solvers of every stripe, in hopes it will inform motivated actions both now and in the years ahead. 1. An overview of food politics. What is food politics? Since biblical times, the policies of governments have shaped food and farming. The book of Genesis, chapter 47, verse 24, records that in Egypt the Pharaoh took 20% of all food production from his farmers as a tax. Some governments in modern-day Africa burden farmers nearly as much by maintaining overvalued exchange rates that favor urban food consumers over rural food producers, and by failing to invest in rural infrastructure like roads, power, or irrigation. Conversely, governments in wealthy industrial countries provide direct and indirect subsidies to farmers, typically at the expense of both taxpayers and consumers. Understanding the political dynamics behind such differences between agricultural versus post-agricultural societies is one of the goals of this book. The food and farming sectors of all states, ancient and modern, are the site of considerable political activity. Rural food producers and urban food consumers have divergent short-term interests, so they naturally compete for control of the far-reaching powers of the state, for example, collecting taxes, providing subsidies, managing exchange rates, regulating markets, hoping to pursue a self-serving advantage. We describe such struggles over how the risks and gains from state action will be allocated within the food and farming sector as food politics. The distinctive feature of food politics is not just social disagreement over food, but political competition to shape the actions of government. If you and I have a personal difference over the wisdom of eating junk food, that by itself is not food politics. But if you and your allies organize to advocate new government regulations on junk food, for example, restricting what can be served in public school cafeterias, the disagreement becomes food politics. Is food politics driven by material interests or by social values? Food politics is driven by both. In poor countries where large numbers of citizens still work in the farming sector and often find it difficult between harvests to afford enough food, material interests will tend to dominate. In these societies, food and farming are still a large part of material welfare for all. In wealthy post-agricultural societies, however, farmers are few in number, and most consumers can easily afford an adequate diet. In these societies, material conflicts around food and farming will persist, but social values, such as values regarding the natural environment or toward animal welfare or toward the preservation of traditional communities, will begin to play a larger role. Country by country, food politics is often similar to other kinds of politics. In democratic societies, it revolves around the actions of elected government officials who confront pressures from organized non-governmental groups in society. In authoritarian or one-party states, it emerges from official rulings issued by political elites who are less accountable to society. Yet, food politics does exhibit a consistent pattern across all countries, linked to a larger process of industrial and post-industrial development. Industrialization brings rapid productivity growth to both farming and manufacturing, but it also brings a rapid reduction in farm employment, as fewer people are needed to produce food. In the United States, the share of farmers in the workforce fell from 50% in 1870 to only 3% by 1990, and to just 1% today. Meanwhile, the growth of urban population and income boosts the demand for food and brings a rapid expansion of food processing companies, private food transport and distribution systems, supermarkets, and food service restaurants. At every step in this process, politically motivated groups of farmers and non-farmers, private companies, and non-governmental organizations will struggle to shape government policy in a manner consistent with their preferences. As the farming sector begins to lose its numerical strength, farmers will organize to take political action and seek government support. In the United States, Europe, and Japan during the peak decades of industrialization in the mid-20th century, farmer organizations demanded escalating subsidies from the state, and those subsidies were provided. By the 1980s, farmers in Japan were getting $23 billion worth of farm program benefits from their government. Farmers in the United States were getting $26 billion, and farmers in the European Community, a predecessor to the European Union, were getting $33 billion. When these wealthy societies later moved into a post-industrial stage of development, the subsidy policies originally set in place to benefit struggling farmers lost much of their original rationale, because most who remained on farms were no longer struggling. In the United States, the average income for farm families in 2019 was 26% above the average for all households. Under these new circumstances, political advocacy around food production shifted away from farm income support and toward health concerns such as pesticide residues, environmental concerns such as chemical use or greenhouse gas emissions, and food movement concerns such as animal welfare or rebuilding local food systems. Political struggles over food and farm policy within these democratic societies are divisive and polarizing, because the opposing positions often rest on conflicting social values, making compromise difficult. Debates over conventional versus organic farming or over industrial versus small-scale livestock production, or over supermarkets versus farmers' markets, provide little space for policy agreement. Yet the policies that emerge in democratic states are typically more successful than those within authoritarian or one-party systems. In authoritarian states, where individuals and groups in society lack an institutionalized political voice, serious food policy errors are frequently made. In fact, serious famines have only taken place in non-democratic societies. The worst famine ever recorded took place in China in 1959 to 1961, during the so-called Great Leap Forward, when radical policy decisions made by the unchallenged ruler Mao Zedong caused an estimated 30 million people to die of hunger. The world's most recent famines have also taken place in non-democratic states, in North Korea after 1996, in southern Somalia in 2011, and in South Sudan in 2017. Is food politics a global or a local phenomenon? One widely quoted legislative leader in the United States, Representative Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, famously said, "All politics is local." This holds true for much of food politics. Analysts like to talk about the world food system, but to a large extent, the world's people continue to rely on many separate national or even local food systems. Wheat is the most heavily traded food commodity, yet 75% of the world's wheat consumption is satisfied from domestic supplies. For rice, only 10% of global consumption is supplied by imports. In the poorest agricultural countries, a great deal of the food available is still consumed within the same community that produced it, or even by the same individual who produced it. When understanding the food politics of such countries, it will usually be local weather, local markets, local social conditions, and the actions of local leaders that will matter most. The heaviest users of international food markets are today's rich, overfed countries, not poor, underfed countries, and much of what the rich import is feed for animals, not food for direct human consumption. For example, the world's biggest corn buyer is China, which imported $7.6 billion worth of corn in 2021, almost all for animal feed. China is also the world's biggest importer of soybeans, again mostly for animal feed. For food staple crops like rice, China has traditionally limited its imports in the name of food self-sufficiency. Japan and South Korea have done the same. Many large countries in Asia, including India and Pakistan, have sought to avoid rice imports entirely. Such policies frustrate food exporting countries, including the United States, and they violate the pro-trade advice of international bodies such as the World Trade Organization, WTO, but separate national governments give international food markets only so much room to operate. In addition to remaining significantly compartmentalized, the world's food and farming systems produce nutrition outcomes that diverge dramatically country by country, and also person by person within countries. When it comes to food and agriculture, the world is far from flat. The wealthy regions of Europe, North America, and East Asia are agriculturally productive and well-fed. Increasingly, they are overfed, while the less wealthy regions of South Asia and tropical Africa are still home to hundreds of millions of farmers who are not yet highly productive and large numbers of people who are not adequately nourished. In sub-Saharan Africa today, about 60% of all citizens are smallholder farmers or herdsmen living in the countryside, and 1 out of 3 is chronically undernourished. In South Asia, roughly 60% of the population is engaged in agriculture, and in India in 2022, the average income of farm households was less than $6 a day. Many control no land of their own and must work as hired laborers. the material needs of poor farmers in these regions remain unmet, in part because their national governments have underinvested in rural roads, water, power, schools, and clinics. The rural poor have scant political power. Many are women with little schooling, unable to read or write, so they are all too easy for governments to ignore. In some settings, the politics of food and farming is addressed within a global frame of reference. For example, agricultural trade restrictions have been the subject of periodic global negotiations at the WTO, where nearly all nations have membership, and global food assistance needs are addressed by the UN World Food Programme, WFP, another universal body. Yet national and local food and farming systems remain significantly separate and divided, thanks to geographic distance, weak transport infrastructures, divergent cultural and dietary traditions, and large gaps in purchasing power. These diverse and largely separate food systems are shaped by the policies of separate national governments, many of which have different capabilities, distinct characteristics, and divergent priorities. As a result, most policy success or failure in food and farming takes place nationally or locally rather than globally. Thinking globally is good advice when working on problems such as climate change, pandemics, telecommunications policy, or international finance, but when considering the politics of food and agriculture, it is often more useful to think nationally, and sometimes even locally. Who are the most important actors in food politics? Food politics takes place both inside and outside of government, among multiple organizations with divergent preferences that compete with each other for influence. Organizations representing consumers will usually want food prices to be low, while advocates for farmers usually want high crop prices, except livestock producers who will want cheap grain for feeding to animals. In addition, farmers' organizations will typically campaign against tight environmental regulations in their sector, supported by the industries that supply them with inputs such as fertilizer and pesticides. Environmental organizations will campaign for tighter regulations. Groups claiming to speak for consumers will line up against food and beverage companies when the issue is food safety or nutrition labeling requirements. Growers that hire seasonal farm workers will want lenient visa requirements for labor migrants, while labor unions promoting higher wages will prefer the opposite. In countries with democratic political systems, each of these groups will cultivate its own special friends and supporters inside government, especially within elected legislatures. In the United States, the organizations seeking assistance for commercial farmers are known as farm lobbies, and they make generous campaign contributions to members of the agricultural committees of Congress, ensuring that once every 5 years those members will support new legislation, a new farm bill, renewing the generous entitlement programs that provide income subsidies to farmers. To guarantee a majority vote, food purchase subsidies that benefit low-income households will be included in the bill, ensuring support from members representing urban districts. This is a standard legislative tactic known as a committee-based log roll. Taxpayers will usually be the biggest losers when the logs start to roll. Has the politics of food and agriculture recently been changing? In today's advanced industrial and post-industrial societies, especially in Europe and North America, the politics of food and agriculture has recently undergone significant change. There was a time when food consumers in these societies wanted just 4 things: foods that were safe, plentiful in variety, more convenient to purchase and prepare, and lower in cost. Now, consumers in these countries routinely demand other things as well, such as foods grown without synthetic chemicals, organic, foods that can satisfy new dietary preferences, vegan, gluten-free, ketogenic, etc., foods grown with a smaller carbon footprint, foods that are locally grown on small farms, and foods produced with less harm to farm animals. Emerging tastes of this kind among increasingly affluent and aware consumers have not driven low-cost convenience foods off the market by any means, but niche markets are now growing rapidly for foods that are local, organic, climate-smart, or humanely produced. These alternatives frequently dominate social debate, and in the United States, advocates for these alternative approaches see themselves as part of a new social movement, a food movement, attempting to exercise hard political power, not just soft cultural influence. In 2013, New York Times food columnist Mark Bittman likened today's emergence of such a movement to other important historical struggles for change, such as the battle to abolish slavery and the long struggle to extend voting rights to women. Within the political arena, however, lobbyists working on behalf of conventional food industries and large commercial farmers have continued to retain the upper hand, much to the frustration of nutrition activists, food writers, advocates for farm animal welfare, and proponents of organic or local farms. Most food and farming sectors continue to move toward greater consolidation, greater automation, more industrialization, and more rather than less globalization. Yet, in cultural terms, new battle lines have been drawn, and conventional food and farming industries know they are under attack. Political leaders, caught in the middle, can find it impossible to satisfy both camps. These new political battles over food and farming are also being projected outward, beyond today's post-industrial societies, into middle-income and transitional societies, and even into poor countries that are still largely agrarian in character. Through trade and foreign assistance policies, foreign investment actions by multinational food companies, supermarkets, and restaurant chains, and the countervailing advocacy by non-governmental civil society organizations, NGOs, critical of conventional food and agriculture, rich post-industrial societies have been exporting their new debates over food and farming to the rest of the world. In commercial terms, the food systems of the world are far from fully integrated, yet the terms of modern debate over food and farm policy have been globalized to a surprising degree. 2. Food production and population growth. Who was Thomas Malthus, and why did he see hunger as inevitable? Thomas Robert Malthus was an English economist who authored in 1798 a highly influential treatise, an essay on the principle of population. In this essay, Malthus argued that food production could never stay ahead of population growth because it would be constrained by the farmland available, an asset that can expand only slowly, while human population tends to grow exponentially. Malthus concluded, "The power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race." Malthus meant premature death from war, plague, illness, or widespread famine. Predicting a future of war, plague, and famine was credible enough in 1798, since these had all been recurring tragedies throughout history until then. Yet it was entirely new to predict, as Malthus did, that these tragedies were sure to worsen in the future due to the inability of agriculture to keep pace with human fertility. Was Malthus right? In 1798, when he wrote his treatise, the Earth had a population only 1/10 as large as today, so numbers of people have increased exponentially just as Malthus foresaw. The frequency of premature death from hunger and famine has not increased, however. The much larger numbers of people living today typically experience many fewer early deaths, and they tend to be far better fed than in Malthus's time. In England, where Malthus wrote, life expectancy at birth has doubled over the past 200 years, from 40 years then to about 80 years now. So, on his own terms, Malthus seems spectacularly wrong. Yet what about the next 200 years? The Earth's population is still increasing, and determined Malthusians insist his prediction might yet come.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?